horrors. Disclaimer. This video was created for informational and historical analysis purposes only. All events described are based on publicly available information, official records, and credible journalistic sources where possible. Nothing presented here is intended to allege or imply the guilt of any individual who has not been convicted in a court of law. The content may include sensitive topics involving violence or real crimes, and viewer discretion is advised. This narration is meant to honor the memory of the victims and encourage reflection, not sensationalize or glorify the acts described. Section 1. Forgotten Horrors. When memory decays. There are moments, deep in the quiet of the night, when I wonder how many stories have been buried twice, once by the earth and once by forgetfulness. The world moves so quickly, always chasing the next tragedy, the next mystery, the next headline that can make our blood run cold. But when the cameras fade and the journalists move on, what happens to the ones left behind? What happens to the victims who no longer trend, whose faces are now just faint pixels on an old missing persons poster curling at the edges in the wind? I've always been haunted by that question. Why some crimes capture the public forever while others quietly slip away, even when they're every bit as brutal, every bit as incomprehensible. Maybe it's because we can hold so much darkness before it spills over. Or maybe, as time passes, we start convincing ourselves that the silence means safety. But silence doesn't erase evil. It only buries it deeper. Tonight, I want to take you through 3 places, 3 moments in time that humanity has almost forgotten. They're not legends, they're not ghost stories. They're real. And they happened to real people who deserved to be remembered. The first is a wasteland of cracked soil and wind, a desert outside Albuquerque, New Mexico, where the bones of 11 women and an unborn child were unearthed in 2009. The second lies in the shadow of pine-covered mountains in California, a cabin that once echoed with laughter before becoming a crime scene so violent that even seasoned investigators struggled to describe it. And the third, far from the American wilderness, took place in a quiet Australian suburb, where a mother and her young daughter were strangled in their own home, their deaths left to fade from the collective consciousness. 3 different continents of grief, 3 crimes that share the same slow erosion of memory. Each one began with shock, the kind that cuts through routine and makes people whisper in grocery lines. For a time, there were vigils, news trucks, sketches of suspects, and theories whispered late at night. But then the news cycle ended. The public grew tired, and slowly, those stories drowned in the tide of newer horrors. What's left now are the bones, the records, and a few people. Mothers, siblings, investigators, who still wake in the middle of the night wondering who could have done such things and why the world stopped caring. This is not a tale of closure, it's a descent into the silence that follows horror and into the ache of unanswered questions. Before we begin, I want you to remember something. Each of these cases once meant everything to someone. Every photograph, every missing person report, every newspaper clipping, it's not just data. It's the last echo of a life that mattered. So, let's start in the desert. If you've ever stood in the open spaces of New Mexico, you know the feeling. The wind tastes of dust and loneliness. The sky stretches forever, but the land below feels ancient, as though it has swallowed more secrets than it could ever reveal. It was here, on the West Mesa, that a dog found a bone. Just one bone, at first. But that single fragment of a person's life was enough to pull back the curtain on one of the most disturbing discoveries in American history. People called it the bone collector case. Others whispered about a serial killer who hunted in the margins,
preying on women the world didn't seem to protect or even notice when they vanished. But the truth is more complex. It's about poverty, addiction, police neglect, and the fragile line between survival and disappearance. And so, as the wind begins to rise over the mesa and the sun sinks into the sand, let's go back to 2009, to the day when the desert finally began to speak.
Section 2. The Desert's Secret. The West Mesa Murders. It began, as many horrors do, with something ordinary. A dog roaming the outskirts of Albuquerque with its owner picked up a bone. The owner thought it was from an animal, a coyote, maybe, or a stray cow. But when the light hit just right, when that pale curve gleamed like porcelain, he realized what he was holding wasn't animal at all. It was human. That was February 2nd, 2009. A Monday. Dry, windless, and deceptively quiet. Police arrived, unsure of what they were about to find. The West Mesa was a place locals avoided. Flat desert land on the edge of the city, a patchwork of abandoned construction projects, brush, and trash. The kind of place where people dumped things they wanted to forget. Over the next few days, as forensic teams marked the ground with colored flags, the sand began giving up its dead. One by one. Bones scattered beneath the dust, rib cages warped by time, pieces of clothing, jewelry, hair ties, traces of lives erased and then left to bake under the desert sun. When the digging finally stopped, the number was 11. 11 women and one unborn child. The news spread quickly. The phrase serial killer flashed across local headlines, but it wasn't just the number that stunned people. It was who these women were and how long they'd been missing. They weren't random victims snatched from affluent neighborhoods. Most of them lived on the edges of society. Sex workers, women struggling with addiction, often transient, often ignored. Their names were Michelle Valdez, Veronica Romero, Virginia Cloven, Julie Nieto, Monica Candelaria, Cylin Hill, Jamie Barella, Doreen Marquez, Evelyn Salazar, Cinnamon Elks, and Victoria Chavez. Each name carries the weight of a life that once had laughter, friends, dreams. Some were mutters. One, Michelle, was 4 months pregnant when she was killed. When you look at their photos, the bright smiles, the teased hair, the 2000s fashion, it's hard not to feel the ache of what's missing. Each of those images froze a moment before the world erased them. The police called the burial ground 47th Street and 118th. Locals called it the Mesa, and soon it had another name, the West Mesa Bone Collector Site. But despite the grisly discovery, the answers didn't come. Investigators quickly realized that these women had vanished years earlier, between 2003 and 2005. For nearly half a decade, their disappearances had been unnoticed in the broader world. Some families had filed reports, others assumed their loved ones had left town, drifted, disappeared on their own terms. It's easy for society to look away when the missing belong to the invisible. By 2009, the bones were the only witnesses left. Detectives formed a task force. The FBI joined. Helicopters scanned the desert with heat sensors, searching for additional burial pits. They combed through phone records, missing persons files, and old criminal databases. One name surfaced again and again: Lorenzo Montoya. Montoya lived barely 3 miles from the burial site. He had a long record of violence against women and had been arrested for solicitation before. In December 2006, he lured a young woman named Sharika Hill to his home. Hours later, she was dead, strangled with a cable.
When police arrived that night, Montoya was also dead. He'd been shot by Sharika's boyfriend, who had come looking for her after she stopped answering her phone. That should have been the end of it. But when investigators looked deeper, Montoya's life became a chilling mirror of the patterns behind the Mesa killings. He hired sex workers often. He owned a truck similar to one seen near several missing persons' last known locations. He lived close to the area where the remains were buried. And his death, in 2006, lined up eerily well with the end of the disappearances. Could he have been the killer? Maybe, but maybe not. The evidence was circumstantial, and Montoya's death meant no confession would ever come. The police never found physical proof linking him directly to the site. Another man's name emerged, Joseph Blea, sometimes called the East Mesa Rapist. Blea was a convicted rapist and suspected serial offender. Police found women's underwear and jewelry hidden in his home, trophies, perhaps. In 2015, forensic testing even linked him to DNA from a sex worker who vanished in 1985, but that was 2 decades before the Mesa murders. When questioned, Blade denied any involvement. Like Montoya, he never faced charges related to the case. And so the years passed. The winds blew across the mesa, scattering dust across the graves again, as if nature itself wanted to bury the shame of human cruelty. By 2011, the task force had dwindled, leads had dried up. In 2018, the Albuquerque Police Department quietly announced that they had no active suspects. The case was essentially cold. What made it worse was the realization that these women's disappearances could have been prevented, or at least noticed sooner. During the early 2000s, Albuquerque police had received dozens of missing person reports involving women who worked in the same parts of town, often near Control Avenue. They shared similar physical descriptions, similar lifestyles, similar dangers. But back then, many were dismissed as runaways or transients.
There was no sense of pattern, no urgency, not until it was too late. Even now, over a decade later, the families still gather for memorials. Crosses line the edge of the desert, painted white and decorated with fake flowers that have long faded in the sun. Some families leave shoes, a symbol of the path their loved ones never got to finish walking. When I first read about the West Mesa case, what haunted me most wasn't the violence itself, it was the silence. 11 women vanished over 2 years in one city, and almost no one noticed. It makes you wonder how many others disappeared elsewhere, in other deserts, other forgotten places, and were simply never found. The press eventually moved on. New tragedies took the headlines. But for the mothers of the dead, for people like Ida Lopez, a missing persons detective who still keeps a binder of unsolved cases, the story never ended. Ida was one of the few who recognized early on that something was wrong. She'd noticed the pattern before anyone else did, a growing list of missing women who all resembled each other. Her co-workers thought she was imagining it until the desert proved her right. In her office, she still keeps the victims' photos pinned to a corkboard, 11 faces that look back at her every day, reminders of lives that the world allowed to vanish. There is an uncomfortable truth about the West Mesa murders. It wasn't just one killer who let them die. It was an entire system. The indifference of police, the stigma attached to sex work, the poverty that made these women vulnerable, and the apathy of a society that forgot them until Bones forced it to look again. No one has been charged. No trial has ever taken place. Theories still circulate. Some think the killer was a trucker. Others believe it was a ring of men rather than one person. There are whispers of police involvement, of drug connections,
of bodies moved from one site to another, but they're all speculation. Smoke rising over dry land. What remains are those 11 names, and a patch of earth on the edge of a city that would rather forget. When you stand there today at the memorial overlooking the mesa, it feels impossibly quiet. The city sprawls in the distance, neon signs, highways, sirens, yet here the wind swallows every sound. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, the missing whispering through the sand. They were not ghosts when they lived. They were women trying to survive. And in a world that often punishes survival, that alone made them targets. This is the true horror of the West Mesa, not just the killing, but the forgetting. Because forgetting is what allowed it to happen in the first place.
Section 3. Ghosts of Albuquerque. The Victims' Lives and the Long Silence. When you read about the West Mesa murders in old news archives, the facts sound cold. 11 victims, mostly Hispanic women, missing between 2003 and 2005. But facts are bones without flesh, and if you only ever look at bones, you miss the heartbeat that once animated them. I remember looking at their photos for the first time. They don't look like victims. They look like friends. Women you might see at a gas station, at a diner, walking with a child, waiting for a bus. They were alive, vibrant, complicated, funny, flawed, and every one of them was loved by somebody. Take Michelle Valdez, for instance. 22 years old, a mother, pregnant when she vanished in 2004. Her mother, Pauline, described her as stubborn and sweet, the kind of girl who loved fiercely even when life didn't love her back. Michelle struggled with addiction, slipped into sex work to survive, and disappeared one winter night without a single goodbye. For years, Pauline begged police to search the desert. They told her to wait. When the bones surfaced in 2009, Michelle and her unborn child were among them. Then there was Cinnamon Elks. Everyone called her Cindy. She was tall, confident, a little wild. Cindy used to call her best friend every few days, just to make sure someone knew she was still out there. One day, the calls stopped. Her family reported her missing. The file was stamped, stored, and forgotten. When her remains were identified on the mesa, her mother said she finally felt peace, not because she had closure, but because at least someone had finally listened. Doreen Marquez was different. She had worked at a high-end modeling agency before addiction took her life apart. Friends remembered her as radiant, with a laugh that could fill a room. She'd gone to high school near the very area where her body was later found. The desert had become a mirror of her own life, a place that once held promise, now holding only remains. And then Jamie Barella, 15 years old, the youngest. She wasn't even a sex worker. She was just accompanying her cousin, Evelyn Salazar, to a park. Neither came home. Both ended up on the mesa. Her mother still sets out candles every February 2nd. When you piece together these lives, you start to see the outline of something much larger than a single killer. You see a city that failed to notice its missing. Albuquerque in the early 2000s was already struggling. Poverty rates were climbing, drug use was rampant, and prostitution had moved from the downtown motels to the barren stretches along Central Avenue. Police budgets were thin. There was no centralized database for missing persons, no coordinated effort to cross-check cases. So the women vanished one by one like lights going out in a long hallway. Detective Ida Lopez, who worked the missing persons desk at the time, still remembers those years like a nightmare that never ended. She kept a binder, a thick one, filled with faces that all looked eerily similar. Dark hair, brown eyes,
mid-20s to early 30s, most with some connection to sex work. She went to her superiors and said, "Something is happening. These women are connected." They told her she was being dramatic. Years later, when the West Mesa graves were uncovered, her binder matched almost every face. The vindication felt hollow. What the city never wanted to admit is that these women were easy to ignore. They were poor, addicted, some had criminal records, many were Hispanic. Society has a hierarchy of victims, whether it wants to admit it or not, and women like them sit near the bottom. In media terms, they didn't sell. There were no suburban family portraits, no college graduation photos to print in the paper, just mugshots and aliases. When I read the early coverage, the headlines used words like prostitutes, drug users, at risk. That language distances. It tells the public these aren't people like you. And once that distance forms, empathy begins to die. But the families, they never stopped fighting. Pauline Valdez, Monique Nieto, Gloria Montoya. They marched, they wrote letters, they pleaded with city officials. They held vigils in front of the police headquarters with signs that said, "Where are our daughters?" For years, they were dismissed as hysterical mothers. Then came 2009, and suddenly the world acted shocked. But the families weren't shocked. They were just tired. After the discovery, the city tried to make amends. A memorial park was planned near the site, a garden of stone markers engraved with the victims' names. When it opened, people came to leave flowers, balloons, even high-heeled shoes, symbolic offerings for women who had walked dangerous streets and never returned. I visited that place once. The ground feels strangely peaceful now. The air smells faintly of dust and sagebrush, and when the sun sets behind the Sandia Mountains, the shadows stretch long, almost like arms reaching across the earth. It's beautiful, and it's unbearable.
There's a small bench near the edge where you can sit and see the whole expanse of desert. If you listen closely, you can hear the hum of the highway, life moving on, while beneath your feet lies the stillness of the ones time forgot. Families still gather there every year. They light candles, some bring photos, others bring small tokens, a favorite hairbrush, the keychain, a folded letter. The ritual isn't about closure, it's about memory. Because if they stop remembering, who will? The investigation, officially, remains open, unsolved. Every so often, someone claims to have a new theory, a former cop, a cartel enforcer, a long-haul trucker. But evidence is scarce. Leads dry up. The desert keeps its secrets. What lingers more than any theory is the lesson of how easy it is for whole lives to disappear when no one is watching. I sometimes imagine the city itself as a living thing, one that feeds on silence. It forgets because remembering would mean facing the truth of its neglect. The West Mesa victims weren't anonymous until we made them that way. They had children who still wake up from dreams of their mothers. They had friends who still scroll through old flip phone photos, wondering what could have been done differently. There's something almost sacred about the persistence of their families. It's as if they're trying to pull the victims back from the edge of oblivion, one memory at a time. In the years since, Albuquerque has improved its protocols for missing persons. There's now a special task force that investigates cold cases involving sex workers. Advocacy groups distribute flyers in rough neighborhoods, trying to ensure that no disappearance goes unnoticed again. But still, for the 11 and the unborn child, justice hasn't come.
Every now and then, a new detective gets assigned, hopeful to crack it with new technology. They test soil samples, re-examine phone records, revisit DNA fragments. Yet, like so many cold cases, time has corroded the evidence. And so what's left are stories. Stories that keep the victims alive in another way, not through justice, but through remembrance. That's why I tell them, not to sensationalize, not to reopen wounds, but because forgetting is the final act of violence. If we remember, even in whispers, even in the quiet corners of the internet, then a piece of them still exists. When I leave that desert in my mind, I always look back once more. The wind moves through the scrub like a sigh. The crosses stand in rows, white against the brown earth. And for a moment, it feels like the land itself is grieving. It's said that deserts never truly forget. They just wait, patient, endless, until someone is willing to listen again. And that's what we'll do tonight. Because the West Mesa was only the beginning. There are more ghosts waiting in a small wooden cabin deep in the California woods, where another family met their end in ways that defy explanation.
Section 4, Cabin 28, The Keddie Murders. When I close my eyes and think of Keddie, I don't picture blood or police tape first. I picture quiet. A small mountain town tucked into the forest of Plumas County, Northern California. Back in 1981, it was the kind of place where time moved differently. No rush, no noise, just the sound of wind through pine and the crunch of gravel under old pickup tires. Families came here to escape. Cabins lined the gravel road, some rented year-round, others left to collect dust between ski seasons. It was safe, people said, the sort of place where you could leave your doors unlocked. And that's exactly what Sue Sharp thought when she brought her children here. She was a mother of 5, recently divorced, trying to start over. Her friend said she was strong, determined, a little weary from life, but always gentle. She had left Connecticut in 1980, driving cross-country in a blue station wagon with her kids. She wanted distance from her ex-husband, from the chaos of the past, from the city. She found Keddie, a cluster of 30 cabins near the Feather River, surrounded by forest so thick it swallowed sound. The rent was cheap, the neighbors friendly enough. It felt like a place where her family could finally breathe again. Their home was Cabin 28. Small, drafty, but full of life. On the night of April 11th, 1981, Sue was home with her son John, 15, his friend Dana Wingate, 17, and her younger daughter Tina, 12. 2 other children, Greg, 5, and Rick, 10, were asleep in another room along with a friend, Justin Smart, who was staying the night. Sometime between 9:30 p.m. and dawn, the safe little cabin turned into a scene that would haunt investigators for decades. The next morning, around 7 a.m., 12-year-old Sheila Sharp came home after spending the night at a neighbor's house. She opened the front door and froze. The living room was soaked in red. Her mother lay on the floor, bound with medical tape and electrical cord, beaten beyond recognition. Near her were John and Dana, also bound. Dana had been strangled with a cord and bludgeoned with a hammer. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the ceiling, on the furniture. The telephone's cord had been ripped from the wall. In another room, the 3 boys were still asleep, untouched, unaware, and Tina Sharp, the youngest daughter who should have been in the next bed over, was gone. I've read hundreds of case files over the years, but few make me pause like this one. The brutality was intimate. The killer, or killers,
spent time inside that cabin. They tied the victims, tortured them, left behind multiple weapons, a claw hammer, a knife, a second hammer that was never found. Investigators were baffled. There was no forced entry. It was as if the killers had been invited in, or had simply walked through an unlocked door, as everyone did in Keddie. Neighbors hadn't heard a thing, except one. Justin Smart, the 11-year-old friend sleeping in the next room, told police that he had a dream that night. In the dream, he saw men attacking Sue and John. But his story shifted over time. Some believe it wasn't a dream at all, that he had seen everything through the crack in the door, too scared to move. The Plumas County Sheriff's Office handled the investigation, but almost immediately mistakes piled up. Evidence wasn't preserved correctly. Items went missing. The cabin wasn't sealed for days. Reporters and curious locals walked through the crime scene. The FBI arrived, stayed briefly, and left again. Meanwhile, rumors spread like wildfire. Some said it was a revenge killing. Others whispered about drug deals or biker gangs. But eventually, attention turned toward two men. Martin Smart, Justin's father and Sue's neighbor, and his friend John Bo Bubaid, a drifter with a criminal past. Martin Smart had a volatile temper and a failing marriage. His wife, Marilyn, was close friends with Sue. In later interviews, Marilyn claimed Sue had been encouraging her to leave Martin, whom she said was abusive. The night of the murders, Martin and Bo were at the local bar, reportedly wearing suits and sunglasses, odd for a rural tavern. They returned home sometime around midnight. Not long after the murders, Martin moved away. Bo vanished. Martin eventually wrote a letter to his therapist, confessing that he felt responsible for something terrible. The letter was never entered into evidence until years later, when a retired investigator uncovered it in an old file. It read in part, "I've paid the price for your love, and now I've bought it with 4 lives.
4 lives: Sue, John, Dana, and Tina. But the sheriff at the time, Doug Thomas, was a friend of Martin Smart. He insisted Martin had been cleared of any suspicion. No charges were ever filed. 3 years later, in 1984, a bottle collector wandering in the woods 30 miles away found a human skull. Nearby lay a child's blanket, clothing, and other bone fragments. They belonged to Tina Sharp. Her skull had a hole in it, a sign of blunt force trauma. The discovery reignited the case, but again, nothing came of it. The years rolled on. Cabin 28 was eventually demolished. The lot stands empty now, swallowed by weeds and pine needles. But the ghosts remain. For a long time, people called it the most brutal unsolved murder in California history. That's saying something in a state that gave us the Zodiac and the Night Stalker. What makes Keddie different isn't just the violence, it's the sense of betrayal. A mother trying to protect her family, children sleeping safely behind a thin wall, and killers who walked away, vanishing into the forest, leaving silence in their wake. When you talk to the surviving Sharp children, there's a weariness in their voices. They've grown up under the shadow of this story, forced to revisit it every few years whenever someone claims to have solved it on Reddit or YouTube. They've seen the conspiracy theories, that Martin Smart and Bo were part of a larger cover-up, that local law enforcement knew and looked the other way. Some theories go even darker, linking the crime to organized pedophile rings, drug trafficking, or secret police informants. But here's what we actually know. There were multiple weapons used, suggesting more than one attacker. The crime scene showed evidence of prolonged torture. There was no robbery. Money and valuables were left untouched.
Tina Sharp was specifically taken, suggesting a personal motive. And Martin Smart's later confessions and behavior remained suspicious until his death. That's it. Everything else is speculation, and yet the speculation speaks volumes about how desperate people are for resolution. In 2016, the case briefly flickered back to life. A new sheriff, Greg Hagwood, reopened the files with fresh eyes. He and investigator Mike Gamberg re-examined old boxes of evidence and discovered that a hammer matching the missing weapon description had been found near a local pond years earlier and never processed. DNA testing began anew. Modern forensics started to whisper possibilities. By 2018, authorities announced they had recovered trace DNA from the scene that matched living suspects. They didn't name names, but hinted that those responsible were long dead. It wasn't justice, but it was confirmation. The monster was real. Whenever I read the official statements, I think of Cabin 28 itself. It's gone now, but photographs survive. Floral curtains, wooden walls, stained dark, a small couch, a television that probably buzzed with static late at night. You can imagine the Sharp family gathered there. Sue folding laundry, John teasing his siblings, Tina doing homework. It was supposed to be a sanctuary. Instead, it became a symbol of how quickly peace can fracture. There's a line between safety and vulnerability, and it's thinner than we want to believe. If you walk through Keddie today, the forest feels heavy, as if the trees remember. The old resort buildings still stand, decaying quietly, windows broken, walls tagged with graffiti. Locals say you can hear things there at night, footsteps on gravel, faint voices carried on the wind. Maybe it's superstition. Maybe it's the land trying to speak. But every unsolved murder leaves an echo, and Keddie's echo is louder than most. For decades, the town has been defined by what happened that night. Children grew up with it as a bedtime warning. Lock your doors, trust no one. Even now, the road that once led to Cabin 28 is overgrown, yet people still make the pilgrimage. True crime enthusiasts, investigators, wanderers with cameras, they all come, stand where the cabin once stood, and feel that same cold quiet settle around them. The silence there is not peace. It's absence. When I think about Sue Sharp, I imagine her last moments not as chaos, but as defiance. She was trying to protect her children, to shield them with her own body. In that sense, she succeeded. 3 boys survived that night because she kept the killers occupied long enough for them to live. It's a small light in a story made of shadow. The Keddie case reminds me that evil isn't always grand or cinematic. Sometimes it's small, petty, personal, rooted in resentment and control. It hides in neighbors, in smiles, in the illusion of safety. And that's what makes it linger. Because if something this cruel could happen in a quiet cabin among the pines, then nowhere is truly safe. As we leave Keddie behind, let's take a breath. Because the next story, the murders of Margaret and Shauna Tapp, isn't any easier. It takes us far from the forests of California to a quiet Australian suburb where another kind of silence reigned. The silence of a house where 2 lives ended in the dark and no one heard a thing.
Well, Section 5. Echoes in the Pines. The aftermath of Keddie. They say that after violence, the world never really goes back to normal. It just learns to pretend. Keddie learned to pretend. In the weeks after the murders,
Reporters crowded the narrow mountain roads. Television vans idled outside the old cabins, their antennas stabbing at the fog. Locals hid indoors. Children whispered to each other that monsters had come down from the hills. And then, almost as quickly as it began, the attention drifted away. The cameras packed up. The reporters left. But the town didn't breathe easier. It just stopped breathing altogether. For the survivors, normal was gone. Sheila Sharp, the daughter who found the bodies, was only 12 years old. She never really spoke publicly about what she saw that morning, and who could blame her? Every door creak, every snap of pine outside her window must have carried the sound of that discovery. Her brothers, Rick and Greg, who had slept through the attack in the next room, grew up under the shadow of survivor's guilt. They lived knowing that their mother and siblings had died just a few steps away. In later interviews, they described the silence that followed them, how neighbors avoided eye contact, how even teachers didn't know what to say. The town had no script for grief on that scale. Every family in Keddie locked their doors for the first time that spring. Sue Sharp's relatives back east tried to understand what had happened. They asked the sheriff for updates, for reports, for anything that could make sense of it. The answers were always the same. We're still looking into it. But months turned into years. Evidence went missing, leads went cold. People started to talk about a curse, as if evil itself had settled over the mountains and taken root. In small towns where isolation amplifies everything, rumor becomes currency. Someone claimed to have seen two men leaving the cabin that night. Another swore that strange vehicles were parked near the bridge before dawn. Theories multiplied like weeds, each one trying to fill the vacuum left by an investigation that had lost control. And in that vacuum, fear thrived. By the mid-1980s, Keddie wasn't the same. The resort closed, cabins fell into disrepair, roofs collapsing under snow. Locals moved away. Only the stubborn ones remained, the ones too poor or too proud to leave. At night, they said, you could still hear crying in the woods. But beyond the folklore, there were real people who couldn't escape what happened. Marilyn Smart, Martin's estranged wife, left town and tried to rebuild her life. Years later, she told journalists that she was certain her ex-husband and his friend Beau had done it. She said he hated Sue because she told him to leave him. Her confession should have been a turning point, but by then, Martin was long gone. Even decades later, Marilyn would still receive phone calls from strangers asking if she knew more. She never stopped insisting she'd already told them everything. When Tina Sharp's remains were found in 1984, there was a moment, just a flicker of hope, that the case might finally break open. But instead, it deepened the wound. The forest had hidden her for 3 years. The discovery site was 30 miles away, and investigators never figured out how she got there. The idea that someone had taken the time to move her body, a 12-year-old child, made the cruelty feel almost deliberate. The surviving brothers built a small wooden cross at the spot where she was found. The paint has peeled now, but sometimes locals still leave small stuffed animals at its base. As the decades turned, Keddie became a kind of ghost story. Urban explorers crept into the abandoned cabins with flashlights and cameras. They filmed the decay, broken windows, collapsed ceilings, the faint outlines of furniture. Cabin 28 itself stood for years as a dark monument, attracting thrill seekers and trespassers. You can still find grainy photos online, the walls tagged with graffiti, the floorboards rotted through, nature reclaiming what was left. In 2004, the structure was finally torn down, but its legend only grew. Documentaries began to appear: Horror in the Woods, Cabin 28, The Keddie Murders, podcasts dissecting the inconsistencies, forums with hundreds of pages of speculation. Everyone wanted to be the one to solve it.
But for those who actually lived it, the attention felt like salt in the wound. Imagine surviving the most traumatic night of your life, and decades later, strangers are arguing about it for entertainment. That's the paradox of true crime. It preserves memory, but it also feeds on pain. In the 2010s, a new generation of investigators, men who had grown up hearing the whispers, decided to take another look at the Keddie case. Mike Gamberg, a retired Plumas County investigator, reopened the case alongside Sheriff Greg Hagwood. Both had personal ties to Keddie. They knew the Sharps as kids. When they dusted off the old boxes of evidence, what they found was infuriating. Crucial reports missing, tapes mislabeled. A hammer discovered near a local pond years earlier that matched the description of one missing from the smart home, never tested, never logged. Gamberg said something that still echoes with me. It wasn't that this case couldn't be solved, it's that it was never truly investigated. With new forensic methods, they began extracting DNA from old bindings and tape residue. Small miracles of science breathing life back into a 35-year-old case. In 2018, authorities publicly stated that they had obtained partial DNA profiles linked to living suspects. They didn't name them, but hinted that the killers were already known and possibly deceased. Even in that anticlimactic revelation, there was a strange comfort. Someone, somewhere, had finally confirmed what everyone suspected. It hadn't been random. For the surviving Sharp family, closure never really came. You can't build closure on maybes. They've learned to live with the duality, that their story belongs to them, but also to history. Every few years, a journalist knocks on the door, asking for another quote, another photograph. And each time, the family must reopen the wound just enough to keep their mother's memory from fading. In interviews, they always say the same thing. We just want people to remember her as she was, not as what was done to her. It's a sentiment I've heard before, in nearly every case like this. Victims become headlines, then footnotes. Their lives are reduced to a single night. But remembering their humanity, that's the rebellion against oblivion. There's something almost gothic about Keddie now. Nature has reclaimed the land, swallowing the past under moss and pine needles. But the story refuses to die. People still drive up there, not for spectacle, but to stand in silence. They say the air feels heavier near where Cabin 28 once stood. The pine smell turns sharper, the birds go quiet. I believe it. Some places remember suffering too vividly to ever feel calm again. If you kneel there, if you let your hand rest on the cool earth, you can almost sense the lingering heartbeat of the past. Faint, but still there. What makes Keddie linger in me isn't the gore or the mystery, it's the idea of interruption. A family trying to rebuild, a mother protecting her children, a sleepy town minding its own business, all interrupted by a moment of human cruelty that defies logic. That interruption ripples outward, distorting everything around it. Decades later, the ripples still move. Every unsolved case is like that. It's not just the lack of answers, it's the way uncertainty becomes a living thing, feeding on memory. The residents of Keddie learned to live beside it. They drive past the spot, pretending not to glance at the trees, but they remember. Always. And I think that's what true horror is. Not ghosts or monsters, but the endurance of pain, how it seeps into soil
into generations, until forgetting feels impossible. Keddie remains one of California's darkest mysteries, but it's also a mirror, reflecting what happens when institutions fail, when evidence is ignored, when people stop listening. The forest keeps its silence, but the silence is heavy with truth. And from those pine shadows, our path leads now across an ocean, to a suburb far from these woods, where another house once held its own quiet tragedy. This next one doesn't have the grandeur of serial killer lore or Hollywood retellings. It's smaller, simpler. A single home on a single night. And yet, in its stillness, it might be the most haunting of all.
Section 6. The Mother and the Child. The Murders of Margaret and Sienna Tapp. There's something about suburban stillness that can be deceptive. From the outside, every house looks safe. Every garden, every warm light behind a window promises that what's inside is ordinary. But sometimes, the darkest stories unfold in places that look like nothing ever happens. Fern Tree Gully, a quiet suburb east of Melbourne, Australia, August 1984. Back then, it was the kind of neighborhood where people still left milk bottles on the porch and waved to each other on the way to work. You could hear dogs barking, kids playing cricket in the street, the faint hum of lawnmowers on a Saturday morning. And in one of those houses, a small brick home on Kelvin Drive, lived Margaret Tapp and her 9-year-old daughter, Sienna. Margaret was 35, a nurse. Friends said she was calm, kind, the kind of woman who remembered birthdays and always offered to help when someone was sick. Her husband had left years before, so it was just her and Sienna now, a small, gentle family of 2. Their house was modest, cozy, with neat curtains and a flower bed out front. Margaret worked nights sometimes, and her neighbors often saw her waving in uniform, hair tied back, smiling politely before driving off into the twilight. There was nothing remarkable about their life until the night of August 6, 1984. When Margaret didn't show up for her shift the next morning, her supervisor grew concerned. She wasn't the kind of woman to skip work without notice. By afternoon, a neighbor stopped by to check on her. The blinds were drawn. The house was quiet. He knocked on the door. No answer. Eventually, someone called the police. When officers arrived, the front door was unlocked. Inside, the house was undisturbed. No forced entry, no shattered glass, no chaos. But in the bedrooms, the air was heavy with something else, something still, unnatural. They found Margaret in her bed and Sienna in hers, both strangled. Margaret with her own dressing gown cord, Sienna with a piece of electrical wire. There were no defensive wounds, suggesting they'd been attacked while sleeping, but the worst part, and the part that made even the seasoned detectives go silent, was that Sienna had been sexually assaulted. There was no robbery, no ransacking, no motive anyone could see. The killer had taken nothing, just 2 lives, and then slipped back into the night. The news spread quickly through the neighborhood. People refused to believe it. In a place like Fern Tree Gully, murder belonged to headlines from somewhere else, the city, maybe, or the far north, not here, not among tidy gardens and Sunday barbecues. Reporters flooded the street. The words, "mother and daughter slain in their beds," dominated the front pages for a week. Then, like so many tragedies, it faded from the front page, but not from the people who lived there. Neighbors started locking doors for the first time.
Parents stopped letting children walk to school alone, and that house on Kelvin Drive, number 13, began to feel cursed. Investigators from the Victoria Police Homicide Squad combed through every inch of the house. They found a partial footprint near the doorway, a Dunlop Volley shoe print, size 7 or 8, a common Australian sneaker at the time. They also collected strands of hair, fibers, and traces of bodily fluid. Forensic science in 1984, though, wasn't what it is today. DNA testing was still in its infancy, barely understood, and Australia wouldn't implement its first forensic DNA database for another decade. So the evidence sat, bagged, labeled, and silent. Detectives began interviewing everyone who knew the Tapps. They learned that Margaret had recently broken off a brief relationship with a man who lived nearby. He was questioned, but his alibi held. They interviewed coworkers, old friends, and delivery drivers. They checked local sex offenders, vagrants, and anyone with a record of breaking and entering. Nothing fit. There were whispers, though, the kind that small towns nurture like secrets. Some claimed they'd seen a red utility vehicle parked near the house that night. Others said Margaret had mentioned someone bothering her, a man who wouldn't stop calling. But no one knew who.
Weeks turned into months. Leads went nowhere. The local papers kept printing Shauna's school photo, a little girl with a shy smile, hair tucked behind her ear, under headlines that grew more desperate. Police still seek killer. No clues in double murder. Eventually, the headlines stopped altogether. Years passed. The world changed. The case didn't. Margaret and Shauna's murders became one of those tragedies that locals spoke about in half-whispers. Teenagers dared each other to walk past the old house at night. Adults avoided the topic altogether. The Tapp family, Margaret's parents and siblings, grieved in private. They'd light candles every August, but the ceremony was small. The longer the case went unsolved, the more it began to fade from the national memory. Australia has its share of famous unsolved murders: the Beaumont children, the Wanda Beach killings, the mystery of the Somerton man, but the Tapp murders never quite made that list. Maybe because there were no exotic clues, no coded messages, no dramatic suspects. Just a mother and a child strangled in their beds, and a killer who never came back. In 2008, 24 years after the murders, there was finally a flicker of hope. Advances in DNA technology allowed police to reopen the evidence. A small forensic team at Victoria Police's Cold Case Division began retesting the samples collected in 1984. They extracted a partial DNA profile, male, from material recovered from Shauna's body. But there was no match in the national database. The killer's DNA existed, but he didn't. At least, not in any record the system could see. For the investigators, it was like holding a ghost by the fingertips, close enough to feel its presence, never enough to name it. In 2011, police publicly renewed their appeal, releasing updated statements and revisiting the shoe print evidence. They believed someone out there still knew something. A friend, a coworker, a man who once lived in Ferntree Gully and suddenly left. Detective Senior Sergeant Stephen McIntyre said, "Someone out there knows who did this. It's time they came forward." No one did. In 2019, 35 years after the murders, the case was reopened again. New DNA sequencing technology allowed for more sensitive analysis, and detectives hinted at persons of interest, men who had lived nearby in the 1980s, some already deceased. But as of now, no arrests have been made.
the DNA remains unmatched. Even with all our technology, sometimes the past refuses to yield its secrets. When I imagine that night, it's the quiet that chills me most. The house wasn't broken into. The killer likely walked right through the unlocked door. He may have known them. He may have even spoken to Margaret before, someone she trusted, or at least didn't fear. He moved from one room to the next, methodical, calm. He strangled the mother first, then the child. And then he left, walking down Kelvin Drive, maybe under the same soft streetlight that still stands there today. Nobody saw. Nobody heard. A car starting, a red utility vehicle disappearing into the night, and silence. For years afterward, neighbors refused to live in that house. Some claimed to see shadows in the window, the shape of a woman standing near the bed. Others heard faint music at night, as if a radio was still playing somewhere inside. Maybe it's imagination. Maybe it's just the weight of memory.
Because when something like that happens, it doesn't just haunt the people, it haunts the place itself. I sometimes think about what Shiana might have become if she'd lived. She would have been in her 40s now, maybe with her own children, her own home, her own routines. Instead, her story stopped at 9 years old, frozen in a school photo that gets reprinted every time police reopen the case. That's the cruelty of unsolved crimes. They trap their victims in eternal stillness. Margaret's coworkers still talk about her, sometimes when anniversaries come around. She was gentle, one nurse said in an interview decades later. The kind of person who would hold your hand if you were scared. And maybe that's how she should be remembered, not for how she died, but for how she lived. The Tapp murders are one of Australia's most haunting unsolved cases, not because of spectacle, but because of intimacy. A home, a mother, a child, and an absence that never filled. Police still believe someone, somewhere knows. Maybe an old man with a memory he's tried to bury. Maybe a friend who heard a confession, half drunk, decades ago. Maybe even you've passed someone like that, standing in line at a grocery store, quiet, polite, indistinguishable. That's the thing about evil. It doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like a neighbor watering his garden. Every August, the Victoria Police issue a short reminder, a press release, a photograph, a plea for information. Each year, fewer people notice. But someone always does. A retired officer, a journalist, a survivor scrolling through old headlines. And for a moment, the silence breaks, just enough for Margaret and Shiana's names to be spoken again. That's what memory does. It resists. Even in quiet suburbs, even in decades of dust, even when justice never comes. Because sometimes the only thing we can do for the dead is remember them long enough that they're not forgotten twice. Section 7. Silence and Speculation. Why crimes vanish from memory. It's strange, isn't it, how quickly horror fades. How the world can stare into something unspeakable, gasp, and then simply move on. We live in an age where tragedy is consumed like entertainment. A story breaks, we devour every detail, share it, dissect it, dramatize it, and then the next story comes. A new murder, a new mystery, and the last one drifts away, taking its victims with it. That's how the West Mesa women disappeared twice, once into the sand and again into silence. It's how Sue Sharp and her children became footnotes in forgotten California crime files, and how Margaret and Shauna Tapp became little more than names in an aging police folder labeled unsolved. But forgetting isn't random. It's built into us, a defense mechanism. Because to remember too much darkness is to risk being consumed by it.
I think about the investigators who spend their lives staring into the abyss, how they carry it home with them. The smell, the photographs, the endless files. You can't remember everything, so your mind starts building walls. And societies do the same. We choose which horrors to remember and which to bury. We immortalize some, the Zodiac, Ted Bundy, Jack the Ripper, and let others vanish. It's not about the scale of violence, it's about the story. The crimes that linger are the ones that offer narrative, mystery, villainy, pattern. They fit into the myth of evil we like to tell ourselves. Killers with signatures, motives we can analyze, puzzles we might solve. But the forgotten ones, the West Mesa victims, the Keddie family, the Tapps, they resist narrative. They're too ordinary, too painful, too unresolved. There's no satisfaction, no clean ending. And in a world addicted to resolution, the unresolved simply withers away. There's also something more sinister at work: social bias. When victims don't fit society's ideal, when they're poor, addicted, or marginalized, their stories get less attention. Police departments, under pressure, quietly prioritize cases that attract media coverage. News editors pick stories that audiences find relatable. It's not intentional cruelty, it's quiet neglect. But neglect is what allows monsters to move unseen. The West Mesa women lived on the fringes. Sex workers, single mothers, women of color. Their disappearances barely made a ripple in the local paper. It wasn't until 11 bodies surfaced that the world suddenly pretended to care. By then, the killer was long gone. The same pattern repeats everywhere. The less power a victim holds in life, the less space they occupy in death. And yet, their stories matter most because they show us the true boundaries of our empathy. Another reason these crimes fade is the geography of violence. All three of these places, the desert, the forest, and the quiet suburb, share something in common: isolation. They're not the bustling heart of a city or the spectacle of a public event. They're spaces where the world doesn't watch. In Albuquerque, the West Mesa stretched out like an open wound, too big, too empty. In Keddie, the forest absorbed every sound. In Fern Tree Gully, the houses sat too far apart, the neighbors too polite to intrude. In isolation, horror becomes private, and private horror is easy to forget. Then there's the problem of mystery itself. We think we love mysteries, but that's only true when we believe they can be solved. When they can't, when the evidence runs dry and the suspects die, we lose interest. Our brains crave endings. We want the villain unmasked, the motive explained, the scales balanced. When that doesn't happen, something uncomfortable lingers. So we do what people always do with discomfort. We turn away. That's why the Keddie case still feels like a bruise that never healed. The clues are there: letters, confessions, DNA, theories, but none lead to resolution. It's like chasing a voice that fades the closer you get.
The Tapp murders are the same. Every breakthrough collapses into uncertainty. Every new test leads back to silence. The result is emotional exhaustion. And so we collectively stop asking. But the forgetting isn't total. It just changes form. Sometimes it turns into myth. Legends grow around the empty spaces. On the West Mesa, people whisper that the desert itself remembers, that the wind carries voices at night. In Keddie, they say Cabin 28 is cursed ground. And in Fern Tree Gully, they say the lights in the Tapp house still flicker at midnight. Those stories aren't about ghosts. They're about guilt. The human mind trying to make sense of senselessness. Because if the dead haunt us, at least it means they haven't been erased. There's also the role of time. Time doesn't just heal, it erodes. Evidence decays. Witnesses die. Paper files yellow and crumble. But time also transforms meaning. A case that once terrified a city becomes decades later a historical curiosity. The edges dull, the horror becomes academic. I've seen it happen in archives. Boxes labeled "Do Not Destroy" stacked beside dusty chairs, holding lives that no one's opened in 20 years. Somewhere in there are the final photographs, the recorded statements, the pieces of clothing that once meant something. All of it slowly dissolving under fluorescent lights. And yet, every time someone opens those boxes, every time a name is spoken aloud again, memory flickers back to life. That's why I tell these stories. Not to sensationalize, but to resist that erosion. To let the forgotten breathe again. Sometimes the forgetting is deliberate. Police departments quietly close cases they know will never be solved. Families stop talking to protect what's left of their sanity. Communities avoid the subject because it's easier to admit that evil once lived among them. It's easier to turn a house into a rental, to pave over a field, to build a new shopping center where bodies once lay. You can't sell real estate with ghosts. So the past is buried, not just beneath the ground, but beneath convenience. But there's one thing the world hasn't accounted for. The internet remembers. It doesn't forget the way people do. There are entire corners of the web where strangers obsessively gather to piece together old crimes. They dig through archives, digitize court files, map out theories, trace family trees. Sometimes they're wrong. Sometimes they're brilliant. And sometimes they find what no one else could. Cold cases reopened because of Reddit threads. Missing persons identified through crowdsourced DNA databases. Anonymous tips reawakened after decades of silence. It's proof that collective memory can fight back, that the age of forgetting might be ending. Maybe one day someone scrolling through an online archive will stumble across a file name, West Mesa 2009.pdf, Keddie Cabin Report, Tapp Homicide 1984, and see something no one else noticed. Maybe the dead are just waiting for that moment. There's a word I keep coming back to: resonance. It's what happens when memory doesn't die, it just hides, waiting for the right vibration, the right voice to make it hum again. That's what we're doing here together. When you listen, when you remember, when you say their names out loud, even quietly, you bring that resonance back. It's not justice, but it's something close. Because to remember is to defy the silence that swallowed them. And every time someone whispers, West Mesa, Keddie, Fern Tree Gully, the darkness flickers, just for a moment. And maybe somewhere, the ones who were forgotten finally feel a little less alone.
There's a strange rhythm to forgetting. It's not a clean break, not a single moment of loss. It's a slow fade, like the sound of a song as you walk away from the room where it's still playing. And somewhere in that fade lies the anatomy of how we, as humans, erase. We don't bury the past all at once. We do it in layers. A newspaper stops printing updates. A detective retires. A file is moved from an active desk to an archive. A mother stops calling the station because she's tired of being told there's nothing new. Each step a little quieter than the last, until one day the silence becomes complete, and we call it closure. Closure is one of the most dangerous illusions we've ever invented. It suggests that pain can be sealed away neatly, that grief has a finish line, but it doesn't. Ask the families of the West Mesa women. Ask the Sharp children. Ask what's left of the Tapp family. Closure never came. It just changed shape. It became ritual,
a photograph on a nightstand, a candle lit once a year, a name whispered before sleep. And that is the real anatomy of remembrance. When the systems fail, memory survives in the smallest, most human gestures. But the mechanisms of forgetting are institutional as much as personal. In police departments, cold cases become statistics, budgets get cut, evidence rooms fill, and when a detective retires, sometimes their cases retire with them. There are entire walls in precincts lined with boxes whose labels are fading. Inside, clothing sealed in plastic, Polaroids curling at the edges, reports typed on yellowing paper. Each one represents someone's worst day, someone's last breath, someone's unanswered question. And yet, there they sit, gathering dust, waiting for a moment of rediscovery. That rediscovery rarely comes from within. It comes from the outside. From journalists, podcasters, amateur sleuths, from voices like yours and mine that refuse to let go. That's the irony of the digital age. While technology makes forgetting easier, it also makes remembering possible again. The cases we've talked about tonight, they're not trending hashtags. They're whispers that move quietly through message boards, through late-night YouTube videos, through cold case forums. Each time someone searches their names, the silence trembles. There's also something deeper, a kind of moral amnesia that shapes which victims we honor. We build monuments for the innocent, but often ignore the flawed. We empathize with the good victims, the ones who fit our idea of purity, but what about the rest? The women of West Mesa lived hard lives. They were poor, addicted, sex workers, and yet they were mothers, daughters, sisters, dreamers. But society decided that their stories didn't matter enough, not until their bones surfaced. That's not just a failure of empathy, it's a reflection of our hierarchy of worth. When we forget the marginalized, we're not just erasing memory. We're reinforcing the same systems that allowed their deaths in the first place. Every act of remembrance, then, becomes rebellion. To speak their names is to defy the world that ignored them. There's a phrase used in archaeology: context is everything. A bone without context is just an object. A bone with context becomes a story, a life. The same is true for history. If we strip these crimes from their social context, poverty, misogyny, institutional neglect, we turn them into isolated horrors, detached from the machinery that produced them. But when we place them back in context, we see the anatomy of forgetting clearly. The victims society doesn't value enough to protect. The investigators too overwhelmed or underfunded to pursue. The public that moves on before the story is done. It's not one failure. It's a chorus of small abandonments. Still, remembering hurts. That's another truth we rarely say out loud. To remember is to reopen the wound.
That's why even survivors sometimes choose silence. Not out of indifference, but self-preservation. Think of Sheila Sharp, who found her family that morning in Keddie. She doesn't give interviews anymore. She doesn't attend the anniversary gatherings, and who could blame her? Some memories aren't meant to be spoken every day. But even silence can be a form of remembrance, a private, sacred kind. Not every memory needs to be loud. Some need to be whispered. When I think about these three cases, the desert, the cabin, the quiet house, I see them as parts of the same organism. Each one reveals a piece of how we deal with horror.
The West Mesa Murders show what happens when society looks away from the vulnerable. The Keddie Murders reveal what happens when systems collapse under their own corruption. And the Tapp Murders expose the fragility of perceived safety, how easily violence can slip through the cracks of ordinary life. Together, they form a map of forgetting. But if forgetting has an anatomy, so does remembrance. It begins with curiosity, the small, stubborn question that refuses to die. What really happened? Then comes empathy, the realization that these aren't cases, but people. And finally comes action, the decision to keep the story alive even when no one else will. That's what true remembrance looks like. Not monuments, not headlines, but persistence. I sometimes think of memory as a pulse, weak but steady. When we stop talking about these cases, the pulse slows. But the moment someone speaks their names, even here in this quiet corner of the internet, it beats again. That's the gift of storytelling. It can resuscitate the forgotten. The police can't always find the killer, but we can make sure the victims aren't erased. One day, someone might solve these cases. A DNA match might appear. A lost witness might remember a detail. A family might finally get to hear the words, "We know who did it." But until that day, their stories live here, in our collective breath. And maybe that's enough for now. Because in the end, justice and remembrance are not the same thing. Justice answers who. Remembrance answers why. And as long as we keep asking why, we keep the truth alive.
There's a moment in every investigation when hope turns to dust, when the evidence stops talking, and the silence feels final. But silence, as science has shown, isn't always the end. Sometimes it's just waiting for the right kind of listening. For decades, the cases we've talked about tonight, West Mesa, Keddie, Fern Tree Gully, existed in that limbo. The files yellowed, the detectives retired, the families aged. But in laboratories across the world, something was changing, quietly, invisibly. Technology was beginning to give the dead a voice again. DNA used to be a whisper. Now it's a symphony. In the 1980s, it was revolutionary just to know that a genetic fingerprint existed. By the 1990s, it was solving crimes. By the 2000s, it was freeing the innocent. And now, in the 2020s, it's doing something almost miraculous, resurrecting forgotten cases. The bones found on the West Mesa still hold microscopic traces, fragments of life preserved in the dry desert. Each tooth, each strand of hair is a library of data waiting to be read. And the technology to read it, to match it, grows sharper every year. Even the faintest DNA recovered from a decades-old crime scene can now be sequenced and compared across millions of profiles. Genealogical databases, once used for families tracing their heritage, have become tools of justice. Through them, investigators have tracked killers who thought they'd buried their secrets forever. The Golden State Killer, the NorCal rapist, countless others. All found because someone, somewhere, uploaded their DNA to find a cousin. That's why detectives in New Mexico still haven't given up. Somewhere in that desert, evidence remains. A cigarette butt, a hair, a trace of saliva on a piece of duct tape. They're small things, yes, but small things can speak volumes. Forensics isn't magic. It's persistence. It's the belief that nothing stays silent forever. And it's not just DNA.
There's geospatial forensics, mapping crime scenes through satellite data. LiDAR scanning, reconstructing terrain from decades ago. Digital pattern analysis, connecting missing persons across jurisdictions through algorithms that see patterns humans miss. Even AI reconstruction is beginning to give faces back to bones, rebuilding features from fragments, creating likenesses that can be recognized by someone scrolling online. In a world drowning in data, the dead have new ways to be found. But technology alone can't resurrect the forgotten. It still needs faith. Faith from investigators who refuse to give up when budgets run dry. Faith from families who keep calling year after year, long after the reporters stop answering. Faith from strangers, from us, that remembering still matters. Because sometimes all it takes is one person who refuses to let a name fade. I once spoke to a forensic anthropologist who said something I'll never forget. She said, "The bones don't lie, but they don't speak unless you ask the right questions." That stayed with me, because it's not just about evidence. It's about curiosity, empathy, and time. The dead aren't hiding their secrets out of malice. We just haven't learned how to listen closely enough. When investigators reopened the Keddie case in the 2010s, they didn't have new witnesses or confessions. What they had were fragments, half-processed evidence, overlooked objects, tapes mislabeled and forgotten. When they went back through it all, they found patterns that earlier investigators had missed. And when they tested old materials with modern DNA tools, they found something extraordinary: biological traces linking to living suspects. Even without names, that was proof that time hadn't won. That's the power of persistence. The same thing happened in Australia. In 2019, when detectives reopened the Tapp murders, they didn't expect miracles. They just hoped. And hope, in the right hands, becomes a methodology. They used advanced next-generation sequencing, testing minute DNA fragments once thought unusable. They cross-referenced old evidence with global genealogical databases. They reanalyzed the shoe print with new 3D imaging software.
They found new persons of interest. The public never learned their names, but investigators hinted that the killer was finally within reach, perhaps already dead, perhaps still alive, living quietly under a new name. Either way, the silence had shifted. That's what forensic science does best. It reopens rooms we thought were sealed. There's something profoundly human about that. We build machines to measure, extract, and decode, but what drives them is love. Not the sentimental kind, the stubborn kind. The kind that refuses to stop asking questions. Every lab technician, every detective, every volunteer genealogist is, in a way, an act of defiance, standing against the erosion of memory. Because as long as someone is looking, the story isn't over. But even as science moves forward, it raises moral questions. How much privacy are we willing to give up to catch the monsters of the past? Should we use genetic data from people who never consented if it means bringing closure to the families of victims? There's no simple answer. For some, it's justice. For others, it's intrusion. But maybe justice was never supposed to be simple. The world we live in now exists in a strange duality. Every click, every upload, every test both preserving and exposing. It's unsettling, yes, but it's also the best chance we have to stop the silence from winning. And then there's something beyond science, something almost spiritual. When archaeologists uncover ancient graves, they often pause before beginning their work. A moment of silence, a quiet acknowledgement, because they know they're disturbing something sacred, not in a religious sense,
but in a human one. The same is true of cold cases. When a forensic team opens an old file, they're not just chasing evidence, they're reaching through time, touching what remains of a life, and asking permission to speak for it. That's not data, that's reverence. When bones speak again, it's not always loud. Sometimes it's just a match on a database, a number glowing on a screen, a detective closing her eyes and whispering, "We found you." That's what justice looks like now, not a courtroom drama, but a whisper across decades. And maybe that's the most fitting kind, because these stories didn't begin with screams or sirens. They began with quiet. The quiet of deserts, forests, and sleeping suburbs. And so perhaps it's only right that their resolutions come in quiet too. Every time I read about another cold case solved after 30 or 40 years, I feel a kind of quiet awe. Not because the monster is finally named, but because it proves that time doesn't erase everything. It proves that memory, when tended to, can outlive even death. The earth may cover bones, but it cannot silence truth forever. And when that truth rises, whether through science, chance, or simple human persistence, it doesn't just solve a crime. It restores dignity. It tells the world, you mattered. The past isn't done talking. We just have to keep listening.
When the story ends, there's always a moment of stillness, the kind that fills the room after a long breath out, as if even the air is thinking about what it just heard. That's where we are now, at the end of a night spent walking through deserts, cabins, and quiet houses, at the edge of history's silence. And in that silence, something lingers. Not fear, exactly, but awareness. A reminder that the dark isn't just the absence of light. It's a space where the forgotten wait to be seen again. I've spent hours reading about them. The women of West Mesa, Sue Sharp and her family, Margaret and little Sienna Tapp. Different worlds, different decades, the same cold ache. Every one of them once had a heartbeat that sounded like yours. Every one of them had moments of laughter, of boredom, of small routines that meant nothing at the time and everything now. They brushed their teeth, folded clothes, answered phones, turned off lights before bed, and then someone decided that was where their story would end. But maybe it didn't. Because tonight, you and I spoke their names, and that's a kind of resurrection. The older I get, the more I think memory is a living thing. It's not trapped in paper or databases. It feeds on attention. When you listen, you feed it. When you forget, it starves. That's why these stories return, like echoes across decades. Each retelling breathes a little air back into their lungs. And maybe that's why I keep whispering them into the dark. Because the dark listens in a way daylight never does. There's something intimate about this work. People think true crime storytelling is about killers. It isn't. It's about absence. About the space left behind when a life is taken. I imagine the empty rooms, the coffee cups left unwashed, the shoes beside the door. Those are the real memorials. When we tell their stories, we're not glorifying the violence, we're tracing the outline of what was lost. That outline matters. It's how humanity recognizes itself. We live in a world obsessed with noise. Scrolling headlines, breaking alerts, endless distraction. But darkness, real darkness, demands quiet. And in that quiet, we hear what we've tried so hard to bury. Not just the crimes, but what they reveal about us. Our capacity for cruelty, our tendency to look away, our strange, fragile hope that someone else will fix what's broken. That's the hardest truth of all. Not that monsters exist, but that they often survive because we stop watching. Remember the West Mesa desert?
11 women hidden beneath shifting sand. The police first thought it was a dumping ground, a single killer's secret. But over time, it became something larger, a mirror. It showed how easily society abandons those who fall outside its neat definitions of worth. Women struggling with addiction, with poverty, with stigma. Women who vanished without the world blinking. When the wind uncovered their bones, it wasn't just a crime scene. It was a confession from all of us. The Keddie murders too carried that confession. A family isolated in a forest, failed by the system that was supposed to protect them. Evidence lost, witnesses ignored, whispers buried under small-town politics. For decades, people said it was hopeless, but the files remained, waiting for someone to care enough to look again. That's the quiet heroism of cold case work. The idea that justice doesn't expire, that time can't protect the guilty forever. Even now, fragments from that cabin are being re-examined, and every new fingerprint, every partial DNA match, is another crack in the wall of silence. And then there's Margaret and Sienna Tapp, a mother and child whose story feels like a lullaby turned inside out. A home so ordinary, it hurts to imagine what happened inside it. No break-in, no warning, just the sudden arrival of a monster wearing the mask of familiarity. The cruelty of that night lingers, precisely because it was quiet, because the world outside kept sleeping while everything inside stopped.
That's what evil often looks like. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but invisible. When I read about these cases, I notice how many times people describe them as forgotten. But that word isn't entirely fair. Forgotten implies nobody cares, and that's not true. There are detectives who still dream about these victims, reporters who keep old notes in drawers they can't bring themselves to throw away, family members who light candles even when nobody's watching, and strangers, thousands of them, who fall down internet rabbit holes at 2 a.m., trying to piece together what went wrong. Forgetting isn't absolute, it's layered, and somewhere beneath those layers, the memory still breathes. That's why I think stories like these matter, not just for what they reveal about the past, but for what they demand from the present. They remind us to pay attention, to question what we think we know, to treat every disappearance as if it were our own. Because empathy isn't automatic. It's a choice, one we have to make over and over again. If you close your eyes for a moment, you can almost feel the places we've been tonight. The rough sand under your fingers on the West Mesa, the damp wood of the cabin in Keddie, the still air inside the Tapp house on Kelvin Drive. 3 different worlds, one shared silence. And yet, in that silence, there is movement, the sound of time working its slow justice, the sense that nothing stays buried forever. When bones speak again, they don't ask for vengeance. They ask for acknowledgement, for their existence to mean something more than a statistic. And maybe that's the truest form of justice we can give them. Remembrance without spectacle, attention without exploitation. To tell their stories softly, truthfully, until the world listens. I sometimes imagine an afterlife made entirely of sound. Every story ever told floating somewhere out there. Every name spoken into the dark still echoing. If that's real, then tonight, those echoes just grew louder because you were here, listening, remembering. And that's the point of all this, isn't it? To remember, to care, to resist the quiet that tries to swallow everything. When the lights go out, I want you to take one last breath and think of them. The women in the desert,
the family in the cabin, the mother and child in the quiet house. Let their names rest somewhere inside you. Carry them, because that's how stories survive, not on paper, but in people. And maybe years from now, when someone mentions a body found in the sand or a case that never got solved, you'll feel that small tug of recognition, and you'll whisper, "I know that story." That whisper will matter, because memory always begins again in a whisper. So, before we let go of this night, if you're still awake, still here with me, close your eyes. Listen to the quiet between words. That's where the ghosts live. They don't ask for much, just that we keep the light on a little longer. Thank you for spending this time in the dark with me. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel something, even a flicker, let it move through you. Talk about it. Share it. Let someone else remember too. Because the more we speak of them, the less the silence wins. Good night. And until next time, keep listening.